Hi, all, welcome to this series of lectures in psychology. In this session, in this lecture, we shall discuss about the topic that is social influence. As you may agree, we are constantly in our waking life, we are constantly a part of some or the other representation of a society. It could be in various forms. As a student, you may be a part of your your college campus, your fellow students, teachers, mentors, guides, evaluators, or as an employee, you may be a part of you are surrounded by your colleagues, your bosses, your superiors, your clients, your um, um, stakeholders. Likewise, in a domestic space, you are surrounded by um, your relatives and neighbors, parents, cousins, etc. Constantly, the point we are trying to make here is you are, as an individual, you're surrounded by people around you, and you're a part of some or the other society, and hence constantly each of these spaces that you belong to are posing some or the other kind of influence upon you, your thinking, your behavior, and in this session we are trying to understand what are those various types of behavior influences that pose on our that influence our behavior, and how can those be explained as a part of society. What are the various social influences that we are under the influence of, we are affected by. So there we go, social influence. And so the first thing to begin with, fundamental attribution error. We must have discussed this is in one of the early chapters. Just to quickly recall how we look at the various consequences of events, and how we conveniently resort to fundamental attribution, which is sometimes erroneous, which could be right sometimes. Say, for instance, as you look at the image above, when you mess up things, you might very conveniently put the error on the factors external to you. That is, the traffic was crazy, or the kid was sick, or I didn't get the message. As simple as that. Whereas when you see the fault lying on the others, you might conveniently find fault with them. This is what is precisely referred to as fundamental attribution error, which can be defined here as a cognitive bias. It is definitely a bias. As you see, there is less of a balanced judgment, and there's more of attribution, convenient attribution to external factors when it comes to us, and the internal factors when it comes to others, right? Convenient, a cognitive bias that can impact how people interact with others and make decisions, right? So when you lose out, say for instance, you invest money in stock market and you lose money, you might attribute the loss to things like markets were bearish, or the performance of the company didn't was not to the expectations, or economy went into recession. Whereas, say someone else experiences the same thing, you might as well say that the person didn't know much about, or didn't have much of a knowledge in markets, understanding of markets or shares, or the companies, etc. That's precisely what we mean by fundamental attribution error, which is the tendency to attribute other people's actions to their character or personality while attributing your own behavior to external factors, especially when the consequences are adverse. Whereas when the consequences are favorable, you might end up doing just the reverse. You might attribute the favorable consequences to your personality attribute, and you might personality and the favorable consequences of others you might attribute to the external factors like their luck, or just a by chance, or the external factors favoring them instead of calling them as smart as you are, right? So that's fundamental attribution error, which which influences the way we look at things, the way we interpret, the way we draw conclusions. Um, so that suggests, in a nutshell, what it suggests is the situations are always greater than an individual, right? Individual in an individual versus situation, individual um, is greater than situation is greater than the individual. Okay, so the next concept that explains certain behavioral tendency of humans, which we shall refer to as social facilitation, as was explained, observed, and explained by Norman Triplet, right? So he made this observation from an experiment where the cyclists, as you see, um, when the cyclists were put to a race against the clock versus the cyclists who were racing against the fellow cyclists. So it was interestingly observed that the race against the cyclists, the performance of the cyclists was seen to be higher when they were racing against the fellow cyclists as compared to the a cyclist racing against the clock. How could this be explained? Maybe they were under pressure and they were very good at what they were doing, and they had the motivation to beat the fellow cyclists, and their adrenaline had rushed in a greater proportion as compared to when they were racing against the clock. So this very phenomenon, where the cyclists were seen to be performing better when they were racing against fellow cyclists as compared to a race against the clock, was termed as social facilitation, right? Which means your performance is facilitated, your performance is enhanced, your performance improves when you are a part of your fellow contestants in the contest rather than contesting against a clock, right? Likewise, a more interesting observation was made in the behavior of ants when the sand when the ant dug the sand alone versus when the ant dug the sand in company of its fellow ants. The sand dug in company was seen to be greater than the sand dug alone, which further explains the phenomena of social facilitation. Now, while social facilitation was one observation, likewise, there was also a contrarian observation made, which is referred to as social inhibition. So, for instance, what you see here, when the kids are put in company of other kids to solve mathematics problems, fairly complex problems, it was observed that the number of errors they make in the company of others was greater than the number of errors they would make when they are doing it by themselves, right? As you see in the left hand side, the kid is solving by himself in his own company, and the number of errors he is likely to commit was observed to be lesser as compared to a situation where the kid is called on to the board and is asked to solve a problem in the presence of others. What would you call this phenomenon? While social facilitation had held good, social inhibition had also been observed equally likely. Now, what is determining as to which scenario would result in social facilitation? Inhibition would mean a deterrent, something that affects the performance adversely, unfavorably, right? So, which scenario would result in social facilitation and which scenario would result in social inhibition was a puzzle to solve, and that can be. So, it was further observed when the kids were put through complex mazes. The number of errors they had committed in presence of others was higher than the number of errors they had committed when they were in their own company. Whereas the kids, when they were put through easy mazes, the errors they would commit, the success quotient that they would register in presence of others was greater than the success when they were doing it by in their own company. So it had something to do with the nature of the task or the complexity of the task. So the entire discussion of facilitation and inhibition boils down to this 2 by 2 matrix as we see. If we split the the x-axis into two quadrants, that is by nature of by virtue of the nature of task, simple task and complex task, and the y-axis into two scenarios um, where you have contestants in their own company and in the company of others. So that splits the entire thing into four quadrants. So if you look at the first quadrant, that is the quadrant A, the left top corner, where the participant is engaged in a simple task and alone the performance or the outcome is say A. And when the simple task, the same simple task is performed in the company of others, as you see in the quadrant below, the performance was recorded was greater than the other one, greater than the one above, right? Greater than A. If A was a performance of a candidate engaged in simple task alone, the same task when was performed in company of others, the performance was greater than A, which is resulting in social facilitation. Whereas when you look at the other quadrant, right top corner, when a candidate was engaged in complex task alone, the performance, say if he or she delivers a performance B, the same complex task when performed in company of others, the performance registered was less than B, right? Which explains social inhibition. So it's not just the whether you're doing a task alone or in company, but also the nature of task, whether task is simple or complex, which results in social facilitation or social inhibition. So the bottom line is attention favors simple tasks and inhibits complex tasks. Right? When you have others' attention and when you're engaged in simple tasks, your performance is likely to improve. And when you are engaged in complex tasks and when you have others' attention, you're likely to commit more errors. So that explains both the phenomena of social facilitation and social inhibition. Okay, that takes us to another concept in the scope of social influence, which we understand as de-individuation. What would that mean? De-individuation, which means, as the word suggests, which means an individual, an individual's individuality is compromised, and when the individual is influenced more by the people around him, the group around him, or the crowd around him, or the mob around him or her, the individuality dissolves, and which was very convincingly observed by Gustave Le Bon, who records in his book Crowd. Some of the statements by Gustave Le Bon in his book Crowd are worth taking a look at. If you read out, he says, the masses have never thirsted after truth. So, truth is not what matters when you are a part of a larger mob or a group. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master, right? Whatever you are given to believe is what you end up believing, rather than striving, rather than reaching out, wanting to reach out to the core truth, right? Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. So it's not the truth that usually emerges as the tallest entity, but it is what you are given to believe. So, for instance, if you look at those enchanting, those charming speeches, public speeches made by greatest of the orators in the history, right? Leave aside the element of fact or truth or verity. We're not saying that they're lies, but they may not necessarily be all truth. But what you are swayed by, what you are influenced by, is what you are given to believe. Right? So when you are a part of the mass, when you're a part of the crowd, you tend to think like a crowd rather than as an individual. So that's what essentially is meant by de-individuation. All the civilizations we know have been created and directed by small intellectual aristocracies, never by people in the mass. The power of crowds is only to destroy, right? Well, that might sound like a sweeping statement, but if you can take many illustrations, there have been rulers, there have been dictators, there have been kings who have been brought down to dust by the mobs, by the rebellious mobs uh, who went on a mutiny and ensured that the rule ends. So that's how you explain the behavior where the individuality dissolves and a group starts behaving like a mob, and um, it results in certain consequences, right? So okay, so just to further understand, we see then that the disappearance of conscious personality, that is, the individual's personality, the predominance of unconscious personality, the turning by means of suggestion and contagion of feelings and ideas. When you say contagion, what do you mean by contagion of feelings and ideas? That is when you are adopting others' feelings and ideas. Ideas become contagious. They spread like a virus, right? They get contagious. People just embrace, they own up the ideas and feelings of others, and they make it their idea, and the whole thing starts behaving like a mammoth entity. The whole group starts behaving like a mammoth entity, is what you refer to essentially as de-individuation, right? And finally, Gustave Le Bon makes a very subjective remark, though, but then you may agree with it. He says, in crowds, it is stupidity and not mother wit that is accumulated. In other words, he means that the more often than not, most often, the general average intelligence of a crowd is always lesser than the intelligence of any given individual in that crowd, which is why, when it is a mob in action, when it is a crowd in action, the rationality, intelligence, or prudence, or rational, these things do not appear, do not seem to be in effect, right? That's what is referred to as de-individuation. Okay, that's an extended thought on de-individuation. Leo Festinger is one of the psychologists who did a great deal of research on de-individuation. According to him, de-individuation is a psychological state where people lose their sense of self in a group. This is what we just discussed. It can cause people to act in a less inhibited manner. You tend to lose certain levers of your thought process, like fear of consequences, or those inhibiting factors in your cognition might withdraw. You might be thrown open to bold actions in accordance with the group's intentions. You own up group's intentions, and you end up in uh, in bold actions, mob-like actions which can cause people to act in a less inhibited manner, like you see the pictures, vandalizing, sabotaging, lynching. All those are certain acts which an individual will never be able to do, but as a mob, as they de-individuate themselves and they embrace the mob's intentions, they just resort to those bold acts, right? So that's what we mean essentially by de-individuation. Okay, social norms was another a dimension of social influence which was dealt with in depth by Philip Zimbardo. Say, for instance, in his experiment, where that he made these college going women deliver shocks to their fellow um, bunch of college going girls in two scenarios. So it was a contest of questioning and answering, and a wrong answer attracts a shock. And when the women were given anonymity, these were seen to be more comfortable in delivering shocks to the receivers of the shock as compared to those whose identity was revealed. This brought out a very interesting observation that people people's behavior might change in accordance with the conditions of the scenario. If their identity is known, they behave in certain way. If their identity is not revealed, is anonymous, they might behave in certain other way. If they are individual, they might behave in certain way. If they are a part of the group, they might behave in some other way. And these were some of the observations. So, for instance, another interesting observation that was made by Zimbardo's experiment, about delivering shocks in various particular outfits. The deliverers of the shock were given certain specific outfits, like certain group was given the outfit of the Ku Klux Klan, if you might have heard of this outfit, known for its revolutionary initiatives, a banned rebel group in the United States, Ku Klux Klan, way back in 70s. Uh, so known for its violent initiatives. Nurse outfit, which is more of a life-saving group. Nurse, as is known for its profession, more of lifesavers. Ku Klux Klan, more of rebellious and violent in their own outfit as it is. And it was seen that the people who were in the Ku Klux Klan outfit were seen to be absolutely unhesitant in delivering shocks to people in the experiment, whereas people in the nurse outfit were maximum inhibited by virtue because of the kind of outfit they were wearing. They had worn a mental setup that they had adopted the behavior of a nurse like a healthcare like behavior, and they had demonstrated least um volunteerism or maximum inhibition in delivering shocks. And in the middle of these two was lying the people in their own outfits. So social norms, many interesting things, like you're a part of the group, or your which kind of group are you representing? Are you representing a peace-loving group or a violent group, or what are the intentions of your groups, your outfits, the age group of the group, the social norms? Many factors had come into interesting observations through these experiments by Philip Zimbardo. Okay, now that takes us to one of the extremely interesting, at the same time, a shaking up incident that had taken place in the year 1964 in the United States of America, where this lady called Kitty Genovese who was arriving from work in the middle of night, and that's when this tragedy struck her, when she was brutally stabbed to death by Winston Moseley. So what became a thing of interest in this incident was, what did the people around her do? So though it was a time in the night, but the incident was witnessed by as many as 37 people, and none of whom had volunteered to report the incident to the police, or bringing the incident to their notice. And this had in fact this occurred to many psychologists, study further as to what explains this kind of behavior. This how can you explain this psychologically? Why would so many people in the at the spot of the tragic event, what prevented them from bringing it to the notice of the police? And that brought the psychologists to experiments, um, and which resulted in this term called bystander effect, which is a phenomenon with social psychology that describes how people are less likely to offer help to a victim when other people are present. Although Genovese's case sparked a widespread public discourse about bystander intervention, it's since been revealed that number of witnesses who actually heard or saw the events were largely overstated. Given that, equally true is the fact is the assertion that people around the incident are less likely to report uh, uh, unless someone volunteers after a span of time. And this phenomenon has been referred to as bystander effect. There's a link below if you can, as I thought there may be curious learners to read the article, the original article that just got published soon after the tragic incident of Kitty Genovese, as to how they explained the inactivity of the people around the incident, and how it resulted in the realization of this phenomenon called bystander effect. Okay, so that resulted in several other observations. One of the observations brought out by this duo of John Darley and Pip Latani um, is what is referred to as pluralistic ignorance. Pluralistic ignorance. What would we mean by this? It's an ignorance by convenience. A phenomenon that occurs when people mistakenly believe that others hold different opinions from their own, and this can lead to a false consensus when people conform to the thought to be majority opinion. That is when all of us think that someone else would do it. A pluralistic ignorance, you would just pay a heed to the desired action assuming that someone else will do it, right? Diffusion of responsibility. Diffusion of responsibility, when a person is less likely to take responsibility for action or inaction when other bystanders or witnesses are present. So pluralistic ignorance is when you assume that people hold um, various views which are different from that of yours, and as a result you diffuse your own responsibility assuming that there will be someone else taking care of the situation. So pluralistic ignorance and diffusion of responsibility were two of the interesting observations made out of human behavior from the case of Kitty Genovese, which we discussed just a short while ago. Okay, Solomon Asch was another very impact making psychologist who brought into light the tendency of uh, conformity and compliance. Conformity, what do we mean by conformity? That is when we choose to conform to a norm despite knowing that what we are conforming to is actually incorrect. So, for instance, he had set up an experiment wherein he was dealing with a bunch of seven or eight control group members and one experiment candidate, wherein the control group members were pre-instructed that they with their what they should call out. So, for instance, what they should call out, the test for the candidates was what you see. He drew three strokes A, B, and C, and he asked the members of the group to map one of these strokes with X. So X is equal to A or B or C. While it is so clear, evident that X is equal to B, the members of the group, the controlled members of the group, were pre-instructed to call out C as equal to X, and there was only one experimental candidate in the group who chose, despite he knew that X was equal to B and not C. But interestingly, the candidate chose to fall in alignment with the majority of the members and called out C as equal to X and not B. And this was a tendency observed majority of the times in his experiment, and this is what Solomon Asch referred to as conformity, the tendency to align one's opinion, one's judgment with the majority, rather than and compromising one's own judgment about observations, right? And this can come out in various aspects, like informational social influence, when people lack information about something and look for others to guidance. So in that case, you may not call out your judgment as authentically, as confidently, because you lack information. So you might decide to depend on people around you. Normative social influence, tendency of people to conform to group norms, to be accepted, to avoid social rejection. You might belong to a group or a cult or a team, or a social group with very clear and strict guidelines, do's and don'ts. So even if your personal opinions are not in alignment with the groups, with larger groups, you might as well choose to hide your differences and would want to fall in line with what the group believes. Normative social influence. Minority influence, when a minority group persuades a majority to accept their beliefs and behaviors, right? So when minority groups might pose their influence too. Implicit leniency contract, what would that mean? Implicit agreement between majority and minority group identifies factors that affect the likelihood of minority group persuading the majority to adopt its point of view. So initially it might start with a with an obligatory gesture of majority, that we might listen to them once, but then it starts as a small initiative, and then it will have it is likely, the minority group is likely to have a trickle down effect with a foot in the door policy. When you just make a small little space for yourself, and once you are given the small little space, you would keep expanding your requirements, your demands, your desires, your needs, enhancing your space, and eventually winning your rights, which is referred to as this implicit leniency. So the minority group takes a fullest advantage of the leniency of the majority and ensure that their rights are honored, their demands are honored, resulting in certain social influence called implicit leniency contract. So those are the four ways in which this society around is influenced by the norms and conformity. Okay, then the next, one of the most powerful initiatives by Stanley Milgram through his experiments, he studies obedience a as a type of influence that it has on the people. So as you can see, he drew some of the very powerful observations with the help of a spree of experiments, and experiments in such a setup wherein it comprises broadly three participants. One is the experimenter, two, the two roles that are played in this experimenter, one is a teacher and the other is a learner. And the teacher and learner, the understanding between the teacher and learner is such that the teacher is calling out four words, and there is one word as the answer to a word that matches with it, and the learner is expected to give the right answer. And the condition that applies in this experiment is, if the learner calls out a wrong answer, the experiment, the teacher is supposed to deliver shocks, electric shocks to the learner, and in such a way that with every subsequent question, the voltage of the shock is progressively increasing. For instance, if the first wrong answer, if the voltage of the shock is 40 volts, the second question wrong answer will be 80 volts, and third wrong answer will be 130 volts. Likewise, so on and so forth. It goes on to 450 volts, which is it goes without saying. It's a fatal. It could prove fatal. 450 is a deadly shock, right? But the catch in this experiment is that the the teacher did not know that the voltage of the current, the shocks that he is delivering to the learner is fake, and the learner is not receiving the shocks. Actually, the purpose of the experiment was to see as to what extent will this teacher go on obediently and will obey to the instructions of the experimenters. To what extent of delivering the shocks will the teacher go in response to the wrong answers by the learner. So this at the center of the study, it was to study the obedience to the authority of experimenter. How far, to what extent will the teacher go, was the purpose. And 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 a quick survey was carried out before the experiment had begun, across the psychiatrists who predicted about Milgram's experiments, and their predictions read as they felt that most participants would refuse beyond 150 volts. Why would they put somebody's life at risk? Whereas 4% probably would go beyond 300 volts, and there could be 1% who would go beyond 400 volts. However, when it came to reality about Milgram's experiments, 65% of these teachers who were delivering shocks to the learners, they went all the way beyond 150 volts, um, as against most refusals by psychiatrists' opinions. And no one had stopped before 300 volts, which means there were people who went even to 450 volts, which showed that obedience to authority had a strong influence upon the behavior of the teachers, and they did not hesitate delivering shocks as they were under the influence of obedience from the experimenter. Some of the interesting observations that came out were as follows. When they made a few changes in the setup, in the experimental setup, like surveillance, who is actually seeing over the experiment as what it was in progress. When the orders received from the experimenter to the teacher were directly coming from the vicinity, the obedience levels were 65%. Whereas when the instructions from the experimenter to the teacher were coming virtually from the phone, obedience had dropped to 21%. Likewise, when the learner and the participant, learner and the teacher, learner and the teacher were in the same room, obedience was somewhere between 55 and 50%. Whereas when they were in different rooms, when they were not seeing each other, when they were not audible to each other, obedience was as high as 100%, right? When there were multiple teachers and when they had conflict between themselves, the obedience had dropped, right? Multiple teachers, and who decided, when one of the teachers decided to quit, the other teachers also showed resistance, which means when there was an objection was followed by more objection from the other teachers. When there were multiple experimenters, and when experimenters had a conflict among themselves, the obedience among teachers also fell. Likewise, so those were the various tweakings. So one big message that comes out, observation that comes out, is obedience is a very important, a very essential, very powerful factor in determining the behavior of an individual, right? Ideological justification, when teachers with ideological beliefs or systemic thinking or big picture thinking, when they were looking at the experiment as a part of a systemic initiative rather than an uh, individual action of delivering shocks, they showed more obedience, right? They thought it's a part of a larger initiative and they should not give up in the middle. So they went all the way to the advanced stages of delivering shock 350 volts and 400 volts. So those were some of the interesting observations that came out in the in the experiment. Likewise, another interesting experiment was carried out by Philip Zimbardo again, wherein he had split one big group into two categories. One category would represent the, the jail guards, and the other category would represent the prisoners in a um, in a in an artificial uh, jail kind of setup, a prison setup, was an experiment to see as to what extent will these roles, the outfits, the responsibilities of these two categories, how would it influence the behavior of the two categories, right? And and it was to utter surprise, shocking surprise of the experimenters. It was very clearly observed that the people had actually embraced their roles, and the the difference between the real and real had blurred. The prisoners actually started behaving like prisoners. The guards actually started behaving like guards, and which resulted in the friction, the agitation, the protests, and the unrest between the two categories, to such an extent that Zimbardo had to call off the experiment prematurely before the due scheduled um, duration of the experiment. So the point again that is driving home is that the roles that you play as a part of the group or as an individual, as a part of the society, it has an impact on your personality and hence your behavior, right? So those were various experiments, initiatives that bring into light various theories and terminologies as a part of an individual's as a role of influence that it has on an individual who's a part of the society. Okay, so lastly, the group. When you are a part of the group, you have certain tendencies, as we discussed earlier, and you might resort to something called group think. What is a group think? Like what we saw in conformity, in Solomon asks conformity experiment, we may not want to exercise our individual thinking. We might want to resort to group think because you don't want to fall apart from your group's thinking, right? So group think is a psychological phenomenon where people prioritize consensus over critical thinking or an individualized thinking. You would rather resort to whatever the group feels is right, despite knowing that your independent thinking is more rational, more prudent, more correct than the group's. You would want to avoid a friction with the group, and you would want to rather fall in alignment with the group's interest, which is groupthink. Group shift is a shift in behavior, while groupthink is about your thought process, your decision, your judgment. Group shift is a shift in your behavior, a phenomenon that occurs when a group's collective decisions or opinions become more extreme than the initial individual views of its members. So, for instance, when you're an individual, when you see your most favorite soccer team is losing out to the opponents, you might feel dejected, you might be unhappy, maybe you'll be influenced for a day or two, and then you're back to normal life. Whereas when you are a part of the crowd, a large crowd which is as unhappy as you are actually most likely to engage, to participate in a group kind of behavior. You might end up engaging in vandalism, in sabotage, public destruction, demonstrating your anger, frustration, protest, etc., which is a shift in your behavior because now you're a part of group. and you're not an individual. So that's what defines group shift and group think. And those were various phenomena, various dimensions, various points of view that help us in analyzing an individual from a society's point of view, and various forces that influence the behavior of an individual who's a part of the society. Okay, that's what it is, and we'll come back with another lecture on in the series of lectures on psychology. Till then, see you.